You already know what it feels like to talk to someone and leave the conversation before it ends. Not physically. You stayed. You nodded. You said the right things at the right moments. But at some point you realized you were watching the interaction from one step behind yourself, managing it, monitoring it, calculating whether it was going well enough. And the weird part is you couldn't tell if the other person noticed, or if they were doing the exact same thing on their side. Most conversations are two people performing presence at each other, both nodding, both waiting, both vaguely disappointed afterward without knowing why. I spent years being technically very good at this. Asked the right questions, tracked the topic, never let silences run long enough to feel real. And I remember the specific moment I realized that none of it was landing. Not because I was doing it wrong, but because I was doing it. The effort was the problem. The machinery was visible and people could feel it, even when they couldn't name it. Here's what's actually underneath that. Connection doesn't fail because people lack skill. It fails because the skills they've learned are pointed in the wrong direction, toward managing how they come across, rather than toward the person in front of them. The difference between someone who makes people feel genuinely seen and someone who merely appears engaged is not charisma or confidence or some mystical social gift. It's attention, where it's aimed, and what's driving it. This book is about that difference. The real one, not the performed version. 9 things: presence, first impressions, body language, listening, empathy, story, humor, hard conversations, and the thread that either makes all of it real or makes none of it matter. Some of what's here will be uncomfortable. A few things will explain interactions you've been replaying for years. That discomfort is the sound of something finally making sense. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The loudest room is always empty. The most exhausting person you've ever talked to was probably trying very hard. You remember them. The one who laughed slightly too quickly, who steered every silence back toward themselves, not out of arrogance exactly, but out of something more anxious than that. Who asked follow-up questions that felt like they were reading from a checklist. Who was present in the room, but somehow not quite there, like they were watching the conversation from one step back, monitoring it, managing it, calculating whether it was going well. They were working. You could feel the labor of it, and that labor was the problem. Because here's what nobody explains about social anxiety. The thing you're most afraid of, being seen as awkward, boring, too much, not enough, is made almost certain by the act of being afraid of it. The self-monitoring creates the problem it's trying to prevent. You're so busy observing yourself that you stop being present. And presence, it turns out, is the only thing people are actually responding to. The technical term is the spotlight effect. Your brain's threat estimation system dramatically overestimates how closely other people are tracking your performance. You feel like you're on a stage with a single bright light aimed at you. Everyone watching. Everyone noting the stumble, the awkward pause, the sentence that came out wrong. They're not. Researchers ran a simple test. They had students wear an objectively embarrassing t-shirt into a room full of peers. Think Barry Manilow if you want the actual study. The students predicted about half the room would notice and remember. The actual number was closer to 20%, and those 20% forgot within minutes. Meanwhile, the students were still mentally replaying the moment 3 days later at 2 a.m. The audience you're performing for is almost entirely imaginary. Most people in any given conversation are too occupied with their own internal broadcast, their own anxieties, their own calculations, their own running assessment of how they're coming across, to be doing the forensic analysis of you that you're convinced they're doing. This should be relieving. For most people, it briefly is, and then it isn't, because knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your nervous system are two entirely different things. You can understand the spotlight effect completely and still feel the spotlight. So the question isn't how to eliminate the anxiety, it's how to stop letting it run the show. The shift that actually works isn't positive self-talk. It isn't power poses, though we'll get to the body in a later chapter. It's a change in the direction of your attention. Anxiety is almost always self-directed. You're watching yourself. The antidote is to genuinely get curious about someone else, not as a technique, but as a real redirection of interest. When you're actually wondering what someone thinks, actually listening for what they care about, actually present in their words rather than monitoring your response to them, the self-monitoring loop simply doesn't have room to run. You can't be fully curious about another person and fully anxious about yourself simultaneously. The brain doesn't hold both at once. I learned this in the wrong direction first. There was a period where I was technically very good at conversation, asked the right questions, tracked the topic, gave all the signals of engagement, and I was doing all of it from inside a mild, continuous panic. It was exhausting. The people I talked to probably sensed something, even if they couldn't name it. The anxiety didn't disappear. It just stopped being the center of gravity. Here's what confident people actually have. Not the absence of nervousness. That's a myth that makes everyone feel broken by comparison. What they have is a different relationship to the nervousness. It shows up, they note it, they don't reorganize their entire behavior around managing it. The conversation continues. The anxiety becomes background noise instead of the main event. This is trainable, not through affirmations, through repetition in low-stakes environments where your nervous system slowly recalibrates. The barista, the person in line, the colleague you've been nodding at for 6 months without actually asking anything real. Each interaction that ends without disaster is a data point that contradicts the threat assessment. Slowly, the brain updates. The goal isn't to never feel the spotlight. The goal is to stop building your whole performance around it. Because here's the quiet irony at the center of all of this. The people who seem most magnetic, most effortlessly present, most genuinely engaging, they're not thinking about being those things. They're thinking about you. They're interested. They're curious. They're actually there. The loudest room in most conversations is the one inside your own head. And the moment you stop broadcasting from it, even briefly, is the moment something real becomes possible. Chapter 2. 7 Seconds of Wrongness. You've already been judged. It happened before you opened your mouth. Not fully, not fairly, not with any real information. But a working theory about who you are was formed in the first few seconds of your arrival. And that theory is now quietly shaping how every word you say gets interpreted. You could be brilliant, funny, deeply kind. Doesn't matter yet. The framework was built first. Everything else gets filtered through it. This feels unfair. It is unfair. It's also just how human brains work, and being annoyed about it won't change the architecture. Here's what's actually happening in those first 7 seconds. The brain isn't making a full assessment. It's running 2 rapid background checks, both operating below conscious awareness. Can I trust this person? And can I respect this person? Researchers call these the warmth and competence dimensions. They're the 2 axes on which virtually every first social impression gets plotted. What most people get wrong is the order. Warmth gets evaluated first, always, and it carries more weight than competence in social settings. Not in job interviews, not in courtrooms, but in the ordinary human interactions that make up most of your life. People decide if they like you before they decide if they're impressed by you. And if they don't like you, your impressive credentials simply don't get the audience you think they deserve. This explains something you've probably noticed without being able to explain. The technically brilliant person who leaves people cold. The expert who somehow never gets invited back. Not because they lack substance. They have more than most. But they led with competence and skipped warmth entirely. The gateway was closed before the credentials even arrived. It also explains the opposite. The person who makes occasional mistakes, who isn't the sharpest in the room, but who everyone wants around, who gets forgiven quickly, who gets second chances without asking. Warmth opened the door. Everything else walked through it. I watched this happen once at a dinner with about 8 people. There was a man at the end of the table who was, objectively, the most accomplished person there. He had the resume, the stories, the data. He was also the person everyone felt slightly relieved to stop talking to. Not because he was unkind, because he was cold in a way that felt like evaluation. You left his attention feeling like you'd been assessed and found adequate. The priority is clear. Signal warmth before showcasing competence. This doesn't mean performing warmth. People can smell performance from across a room, and it reads as something closer to manipulation than friendliness. It means letting genuine interest lead. Curiosity about the other person. Openness. The physical and verbal signals that say, I'm not a threat, and I'm actually here. A real smile is one of the most powerful of these. Not the polite smile, the one that involves only the mouth, that everyone recognizes as social furniture. The genuine smile involves the eyes, the corners crinkle. It takes fractionally longer to form and to fade. Your brain knows the difference. So does everyone else's. Mirror neurons in the observer's brain actually activate in response to a genuine smile. You're not just signaling positivity, you're inducing it. Your body is doing a lot of the work before language starts. Open posture, shoulders back but not rigid, arms uncrossed, body angled toward the other person, communicates approachability without a single word. Eye contact that's present but not aggressive. A pace of movement that's unhurried. These aren't tricks. They're the physical expression of someone who isn't threatened and isn't threatening. The greeting itself matters less than most people think. The content of your opening line is almost irrelevant compared to the warmth and ease with which it's delivered. A simple hello from someone who actually seems glad to be there will outperform a clever opener delivered with tension every single time. What you wear and how you've presented yourself signals something too. Not perfection, but care. The message isn't look how good I look. It's I respected this interaction enough to show up intentionally. That reads as regard for the other person, which lands, predictably, as warmth. Here's the feedback loop that makes this worth understanding. When you lead with genuine warmth and appropriate ease, people respond in kind. They open slightly. They become more generous in their interpretations of what you say. They give you the benefit of the doubt. That generosity then makes it easier to actually be yourself, which produces more warmth, which produces more generosity. The whole thing compounds quickly in either direction. The first 7 seconds aren't a performance to nail. They're a temperature you're setting for everything that follows. Get the temperature right. Genuine interest, physical openness, unhurried presence, and you create a room where connection is possible. Get it wrong, and you spend the rest of the conversation trying to climb out of a hole you didn't know you dug. Most people are so focused on what they're going to say that they arrive wrong and spend 20 minutes wondering why the conversation never quite took off. The conversation started before the words. It always does. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. The language your body is screaming. You can lie with words. Your body, unfortunately, cannot. Or more precisely, it can, but it's bad at it, and the people around you are better at reading it than you are at controlling it. This is the fundamental asymmetry that most people never account for. You're running one message through your mouth and a completely different one through everything else, and the everything else is louder. Think about the last time someone told you they were fine. Really think about it. Their jaw was set. Their arms were crossed with a grip that suggested structural reinforcement. Their answers were clipped in a way that communicated exactly the opposite of their words. You believed their body. You believed it instantly, automatically, without deciding to. Because your brain has been reading bodies since before it could read sentences. That system is older, faster, and more trusted. When words and body conflict, people don't consciously decide which to believe. They just feel that something's off. They can't quite articulate it. They file it as a vague discomfort, a slight withdrawal, a reason to keep a small distance. And you never find out, because nobody says, your shoulders were saying something different from your mouth. This is where most communication advice goes wrong. It focuses entirely on content and ignores the delivery system. What you say matters. How your body is saying it often matters more. The foundation is posture, and not in the military way people imagine when they hear that word. Not rigid, not performed, not the kind of upright that looks like someone is trying very hard to look upright. The posture that reads as confidence is actually just alignment, spine supported, shoulders back without tension, weight distributed evenly. It's the physical equivalent of someone who is comfortable being where they are. When you're nervous, the body contracts. Shoulders come forward, chin drops, chest closes. The whole silhouette becomes smaller. This isn't a character flaw. It's a physiological response to perceived threat. But it broadcasts that threat response to everyone in the room, and they respond to it without knowing why. They become slightly less open, slightly more guarded. The dynamic shifts before anyone has said anything meaningful. What's genuinely strange about this is the direction of causality. Most people assume posture reflects internal state. It does, but it also creates internal state. Hold an expansive, open posture for 2 minutes. Actually do it, don't just conceptualize it. And your neurochemistry shifts. Testosterone edges up, cortisol edges down. You feel marginally more capable than you did before you stood up straight. The body isn't just broadcasting to others. It's broadcasting to you. This means you can enter the loop from either end. Change how you feel and your body follows. Or change your body and your feelings follow. The second one is available to you right now, regardless of how you feel. Movement quality is something people almost never think about, and everyone registers. Deliberate movement reads as self-possession. Fidgeting, the constant adjustments, the face touching, the repositioning that serves no physical purpose, broadcasts anxiety in a frequency that's hard to ignore. The goal isn't to become unnaturally still. natural gesture that emphasizes a point is engaging and real. The question is whether your movement is serving the communication or just releasing tension. One of those is useful, the other is noise. Eye contact deserves more precision than it usually gets. The advice people hear is, make eye contact, which is correct and also incomplete. Too little reads as evasion or disinterest. Too much, the unblinking, unvarying kind, reads as aggression or instability. The range that works is roughly 60 to 70% while you're speaking, slightly more while you're listening. This isn't about staring. It's about being present enough that the other person feels seen, with enough natural variation that they don't feel cornered. In a group, this extends to distributing attention across people, brief, genuine contact with each person rather than fixating on one or addressing the middle distance. The people you make eye contact with feel included. The ones you skip feel it. Facial expression is the place people are most unaware of the gap between intention and output. Many people believe they're holding a neutral, open expression, while their face is actually running a separate commentary on everything being said. Skepticism around the eyes, micro pulls of disagreement at the corners of the mouth. The other person sees it. They edit accordingly. They give you a slightly safer, slightly less honest version of what they were about to say. Responsive expression, nodding at the right moments, letting concern show when something concerning is shared, letting amusement be visible, creates the sense that you're actually receiving what's being said, not just processing it. The person speaking to you needs to feel their words are landing somewhere. Expression is the confirmation receipt. The mirror principle is worth understanding here. People in genuine rapport unconsciously synchronize. Posture, rhythm, energy level start to converge. You've experienced this without noticing it. You lean in. The other person leans in. They slow down. You slow down. The synchronization is both a signal of connection and a creator of it. When you subtly and naturally match someone's physical energy, not immediately, not mechanically, but after a beat, it creates a nonverbal sense of alignment. They feel, without being able to say why, that you're in sync. The key word is subtly. Obvious mirroring reads as mockery. A slight delay, a partial reflection of their posture or pace. That's the version that works. Research confirms people rate interactions where they've been subtly mirrored as smoother and more pleasant. They like the person more. They can't explain why. Your voice belongs in this chapter, even though it comes out of your mouth. It's a physical instrument, and how you use it is body language in audio form. Speaking from the throat produces a thin, sometimes reedy sound that reads as uncertainty. Speaking from the diaphragm, that spot below your ribs, where breath actually lives, produces resonance. It sounds grounded because it is grounded. The body is doing something real and the voice reflects it. Pace matters. Rushed speech suggests you're not sure you're allowed to take up this much time. Deliberate speech, with actual pauses, suggests the opposite. The pause is one of the most underused tools in conversation. It creates space for what you just said to actually land, signals that you're not afraid of silence, and gives the impression of someone who chooses words rather than chasing them. I spent a long time confusing talking fast with thinking fast. They're not the same thing. The smartest people I've been around tend to pause. They let the silence do something. It took me years to stop filling it. When everything aligns, posture, expression, eye contact, voice, people experience it as authenticity. They don't analyze it. They just feel that you're real, that you're actually there. And that is, it turns out, almost unbearably rare. Most people are physically present and experientially absent. Their body is in the room, but the signals are scattered. Contracted posture, wandering gaze, voice that trails upward at the end of statements, like every sentence is asking permission to exist. The body is always saying something. The only question is whether you've decided what. Chapter 4. The rarest thing in any room. Nobody is listening to you, including most of the time you. This isn't a criticism, it's a description of the default state. Most people in conversation are running a parallel process, half tracking what's being said, half composing their response, managing their impression, monitoring the room, deciding whether this story is going somewhere interesting. They're physically present and cognitively split. They hear the words. They don't receive them. You can feel this when you're on the receiving end. The slight glaze, the response that addresses what you said 2 sentences ago while you've already moved on. The follow-up question that would only make sense if they hadn't been listening to your answer. The faint sense that you're talking at someone rather than with them. You adapt. You shorten your sentences. You give them the edited version. You stop offering anything that requires real attention to understand. And here's the damage that doesn't get discussed. The person who isn't listening isn't just failing to receive information. They're actively communicating something. You are not worth my full attention. They'd never say that. They'd be horrified to know they were broadcasting it. But the body knows. The speaker's nervous system registers the absence of real presence and responds by withdrawing. The conversation becomes a transaction. Everyone goes through the motions, and nothing real happens. True listening is so uncommon that when someone actually does it, fully, without the split screen running, people notice. Not always consciously. They just feel something different, a quality of contact that most interactions don't have. They find themselves saying more than they planned to, going deeper than they expected, leaving the conversation feeling somehow more solid than when they arrived. That's not an accident. That's the neurological effect of being genuinely received. The first requirement is presence, and presence begins with a decision to stop managing your own performance. When you're focused on how you're coming across, you're watching yourself. When you're actually listening, you've temporarily set that down. The self-monitoring that Chapter 1 described as the enemy of connection is also the enemy of listening. They're the same mechanism, running the same interference. Physical presence helps. Phone out of sight. Not face down, not in your pocket where you're still half aware of it, but genuinely removed from the equation. Body angled toward the speaker, eyes not scanning the room for something more interesting. These aren't politeness gestures. They're instructions you're giving your own brain. The body shapes the attention. Mental presence requires something harder. Patience with a pace that isn't yours. Some people think slowly. Some circle before they land. Some need silence mid-sentence to find the word they're looking for. The instinct, especially for people who process quickly, is to finish the sentence for them, to jump in during the pause, to accelerate toward the point they seem to be building toward. This feels helpful. It isn't. It tells the speaker their natural pace is a problem. They tighten, they rush, they give you the abbreviated version, and you lose whatever was in the part they left out. Waiting is an act of respect that most people have forgotten how to perform. The encouragement layer is what separates passive non-interruption from actual active listening. Small verbal responses, I see, go on, that makes sense, signal that you're following without taking over. They're conversational oxygen. They keep the other person moving forward rather than stopping to check whether you're still with them. nodding at the right moment, an expression that responds to the emotional content of what's being said, not just the factual content. These signals create a feedback loop. The speaker feels received. They go deeper. You receive more. The conversation finds its real level. What you don't do is equally important. Interrupting with your own story, even a relevant one, even a good one, breaks the thread and recenters the conversation on you. Offering advice before it's requested tells the speaker their job was to deliver a problem, not to be heard. Visible judgment, the skeptical eyebrow, the expression that flickers for half a second before you smooth it, causes people to edit themselves mid-sentence. You never hear the unedited version. You get the version they decided was safe to give someone who might be keeping score. The reflective technique is where listening becomes visibly active, periodically paraphrasing what someone has shared, not repeating their words verbatim, but distilling the meaning, does several things at once. It confirms you've understood correctly. It gives them the chance to clarify if you haven't. And it produces an effect that's disproportionate to the effort involved. The experience of being accurately understood. When someone reflects your thoughts back in their own words and gets it right, really gets what you meant, not just what you said, something relaxes. A tension you didn't know you were carrying. The need to keep trying to be understood releases because you've been understood. It's one of the quieter but more profound things one person can do for another. The questions that follow a reflection matter, not interrogation questions, not the rapid-fire what, when, where that makes someone feel they're being documented. Open questions that invite more. How did that land for you? What was the hardest part? What happened next? These aren't filler. They communicate that you found what they said worth going further into, that their experience is interesting enough to deserve another room. I had a conversation years ago with someone I'd just met at a conference. One of those events designed for networking, which is a word for talking to people while both of you are pretending not to be looking for something. She asked me a question about a project I was working on. A real question, not a polite one. And then she listened to the answer. Actually listened. Asked something that could only have come from having heard the whole answer. Listened to that. I talked for probably 10 minutes, which is far longer than I intended, and left feeling like I'd said something true. I don't remember what I said. I remember how it felt to be heard. That's what you're building when you actually listen. Not a memory in someone's mind of the interesting things you contributed. A feeling in their body of having been received. That feeling becomes associated with you. They want to return to it. They seek you out without fully knowing why. The most magnetic conversationalists aren't the ones who say the best things. They're the ones who make you feel like what you said was worth saying. In a world where attention is fragmented by design and everyone is broadcasting and almost nobody is receiving, the person who actually listens doesn't just stand out. They feel, to whoever encounters them, like relief. Chapter 5. What their eyes are actually saying. The most honest thing someone tells you never comes out of their mouth. It comes out in the half-second before they speak. The micro-tension around the eyes when they say everything's fine. The slight shift in posture when a topic gets close to something real. The voice that drops a register when they mention something they're describing as not a big deal. The body doesn't editorialize. It just reports. And if you know how to read the report, you're receiving an entirely different conversation than the one being conducted in words. Most people don't know how to read it. They're too focused on the verbal channel, tracking the content, formulating their response, following the stated narrative, to notice the parallel broadcast running underneath it. They take what's said at face value. They miss the actual story. This isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone. It's about developing a fuller picture. People aren't usually lying when their body contradicts their words. More often, they're ahead of their own language. They feel something before they've decided whether it's safe to say it. The body leaks the feeling while the words are still being managed. Reading that leak accurately means you can respond to what's actually happening, not just what's being said. The first principle is clusters over singles. One signal in isolation is almost meaningless. Crossed arms might mean defensiveness, or cold, or back pain, or just a habit. But crossed arms combined with a slight lean away, reduced eye contact, and a smile that stops at the mouth, that cluster tells a coherent story. The signals are confirming each other. You're now reading something real. This is where most people go wrong when they try to apply body language. They learn that crossed arms mean closed off, and they spend the rest of their lives reading crossed arms as hostility. Single signals are noise. Clusters are signal. Engagement has a physical signature. Forward lean. Body oriented toward you rather than angled away. Eye contact that's active, not dutiful. Facial expressions that respond, not just when something funny is said, but throughout a running, visible reaction to the content of what you're sharing. The voice gets slightly more animated. Gestures become more expressive. The person is, in a literal physical sense, moving toward you and toward the conversation. When this is present, you can push deeper. The conversation can go somewhere real. The other person has non-verbally confirmed they're in. Disengagement is quieter, but equally readable. The eyes start moving, not to you, but around the room, to the door, to the phone on the table. The body shifts. It might turn slightly, not all the way, just enough that the feet are pointing somewhere else. The feet, interestingly, are one of the most reliable indicators in the body. They tend to point where the person actually wants to go, independent of where the face is politely aimed. Responses get shorter. The questions stop. The person is physically present and psychologically already somewhere else. When you see this, the instinct is often to talk more, to try harder, to fill the space with content until they re-engage. This almost never works. What actually works is a change of direction, a different topic, a direct question, an acknowledgement that this line of conversation might have run its course. Sometimes the most socially intelligent thing you can do is let something end gracefully rather than push it past its natural life. Tension shows up before it's spoken. Watch the jaw, the mouth. There's a kind of fixed smile, technically present, technically correct, but not moving, not responsive. That means something is being held back. The eyes above it look different than eyes above a real smile. The tightening around the mouth when someone is disagreeing with something they've decided not to voice. The slight increase in blink rate under mild stress. The hands that were relaxed and are now doing something with a pen or a glass. These aren't signs that someone is being deceptive. They're signs that something is happening internally that hasn't made it to the surface yet. If you're paying attention, you can create space for it. You can slow down. You can ask a question that opens a door. Or you can simply let the person know, without stating it explicitly, that there's room for whatever they're not saying. Sometimes this sounds like a pause and a softer tone. Sometimes it's as direct as it seems like something's on your mind, and then waiting. What you're doing is signaling that you've noticed, that the room is safe, that they don't have to keep managing the gap between what they feel and what they're saying. Voice carries more information than most people extract from it. The content of what someone says is the surface layer. Underneath is pace, pitch, volume, and the spaces between words. A voice that speeds up when a topic gets close to something vulnerable. a slight pitch rise on words that carry emotional weight, the pause before answering a question that should have a simple answer. These are data. They're telling you where the real material is. The person who says it was totally fine in a voice that's doing 4 different things simultaneously is not describing a fine situation. They're describing a situation they've decided to present as fine. The gap between those 2 things is worth understanding. Cultural fluency matters here in ways that can't be skipped. Emotional expression isn't universal. What looks like indifference in one cultural context is restraint in another. What reads as intensity in one register is ordinary emphasis somewhere else. Eye contact norms vary significantly. Personal space varies. The physical vocabulary of engagement and discomfort is not identical across backgrounds, and misreading cultural style as personal message is a reliable way to understand people completely wrong. The solution isn't a set of cultural rules. You can't memorize your way through this. It's calibration. Over time, with any specific person, you start to understand their physical baseline. What they look like when they're relaxed. What they look like when they're uncomfortable. What a real smile looks like on their face versus a social one. Once you have the baseline, deviations from it become readable. You're not applying a universal template. You're learning their particular language. I watched a colleague derail an entire meeting once by missing a signal so obvious it was almost loud. The senior person in the room had shifted back in her chair, stopped contributing, and was holding very still in the particular way people hold still when they've decided something. Everyone else kept talking, kept building the proposal, kept adding detail. She had left the conversation 20 minutes before it ended. Nobody noticed. The meeting concluded. Everyone felt good. She killed the project 2 days later in a 5-line email. He'd stopped reading the room so he could keep performing in it. The people who read bodies well aren't cold analyzers cataloging signals like technicians. They're people who are genuinely, curiously paying attention to another human being. And because they're paying that quality of attention, they notice things that people running on autopilot miss entirely. You can't fake this kind of attention, but you can develop it. You start by deciding that the person in front of you is more interesting than your own internal commentary about them. Most people never make that decision. The ones who do become, to everyone around them, inexplicably perceptive. They seem to know things. They seem to understand without being told. They're not reading minds. They're just actually watching. Chapter 6. The Invisible Bridge. Sympathy says, "That looks hard." Empathy says, "I know that room." The difference isn't compassion. Both involve caring. The difference is location. Sympathy stands outside the experience and observes it. Empathy steps inside and inhabits it briefly, enough to know what the air feels like in there. Sympathy is offered from a safe distance. Empathy requires you to temporarily give up the distance. Most people offer sympathy and call it empathy. They say the right things. They make the right expressions. They produce the correct verbal signals of understanding. And the person on the receiving end feels, beneath all that correctness, still somehow alone in their experience. Because they are. Nobody actually came in. They just knocked politely from outside and called it connection. This is more common than people admit, because actual empathy is uncomfortable. To genuinely inhabit someone else's emotional reality, even briefly, even partially, means allowing their experience to affect you. It means something lands. And most people have become extremely skilled at processing other people's difficult emotions from behind a layer of glass. Present enough to appear engaged. Protected enough to remain unaffected. The problem is that people can feel the glass. They can't always name it, but they feel it. Your brain is actually built for this. The neural mirroring system, the same mechanism that makes you wince when someone stubs their toe, that produces a flutter of anxiety when a friend describes their panic, that pulls a smile from you when someone else genuinely laughs, is designed to run simulations of other people's experiences. When you see someone in pain, your brain activates overlapping regions to those that would fire if you were in pain yourself. Not identical. Overlapping. A partial simulation. This is the biological foundation of empathy. It exists in you already. The question is whether you let it run or suppress it in the name of staying composed and comfortable. Perspective taking is the conscious layer built on top of that biological foundation. It's the deliberate effort to understand how someone's specific history, circumstances, values, and current emotional state are shaping their experience of this moment. Not how you would feel in their situation, how they feel, given everything that makes them them. This distinction is subtle and important. How would I feel in their position is a question about you. It starts with your baseline and asks how it would shift. How are they feeling given their particular life is a question about them. It requires setting your own baseline aside entirely, which is harder and more useful. The question that makes perspective-taking real is, what factors might be shaping this experience that I'm not seeing? Not assuming you understand. Genuinely wondering what you might be missing. Someone reacts to a minor schedule change with what looks like disproportionate frustration. The easy read is overreaction. The perspective-taking read holds that interpretation lightly and wonders instead, what else might be happening here? Have they had repeated disruptions recently that have accumulated into something? Is there something downstream of this change that matters to them that they haven't mentioned? Does unpredictability carry a particular weight for them based on experiences I don't know about? You don't have to be right. You just have to be genuinely asking. This mental flexibility, holding your own interpretation and their possible experience simultaneously, is what separates people who understand situations from people who judge them. Judgment is fast and requires no real effort. Understanding is slower and requires temporarily suspending the first read. The hardest part is doing this when their experience conflicts with yours. When they're describing a situation you were also in and their version doesn't match yours. When they're expressing a perspective that contradicts something you believe. The instinct is to argue, to correct, to insert your counter-experience before theirs has fully landed. True perspective-taking means their version gets to exist completely before yours enters the room. Not permanently. Not as a replacement for your own view. Just long enough to be fully heard. This is harder than it sounds because the counter-argument forms in real time. You're holding it while nodding. The discipline is in not releasing it too early. There's a specific type of response that does more damage than most people realize. It's the empathy hijack. When someone shares a difficult experience and you respond with a similar experience of your own. The intention is to communicate, I understand. I've been there. The effect, more often than not, is that the conversation has now moved to you. Their experience became the launching pad for yours. They notice. They rarely say anything. They just quietly conclude that bringing things to you produces a particular outcome, and they adjust accordingly. Validation is the skill that makes received empathy visible. It's the verbal confirmation that someone's emotional experience makes sense. Not that you agree with their conclusions. Not that you'd feel the same way. But that given their perspective and circumstances, their reaction is understandable. This is more precise than it looks. Validation is not agreement. You can validate an emotion without endorsing the interpretation that produced it. I can understand why that comment felt dismissive, given the context you were working in. That's not confirming the comment was intentionally dismissive. It's confirming that their experience of it as dismissive makes sense. Those are different things. The first is a factual claim. The second is an acknowledgement of their reality. The relief that validation produces is disproportionate to the effort it requires. When someone's feelings are acknowledged as legitimate rather than questioned or minimized, emotional intensity tends to decrease. Not because the problem is solved, because the additional burden of feeling misunderstood or alone in the experience has been lifted. The problem remains. The isolation around it dissolves. The normalizing move is related. Many people carry their difficult emotions with a layer of shame attached. Not just that the situation is hard, but that their reaction to it is excessive or weak or embarrassing. A simple many people would feel that way, or that's a natural response to something that unpredictable, removes the shame without minimizing the situation. They're still dealing with the thing. They're no longer also dealing with the judgment they assumed was coming. There are limits to empathy that don't get discussed often enough. It doesn't scale infinitely. Genuine emotional immersion in other people's experiences has a cost, and people who give it constantly without replenishment develop a kind of numbness that defeats the whole purpose. The solution isn't less empathy. It's more deliberate recovery, knowing when to step back from carrying what isn't yours to carry long-term. There's also the cultural dimension. Emotional expression varies enormously. In some contexts, a very muted response represents significant internal distress. In others, a highly expressive response is standard and doesn't indicate crisis. Someone's external affect is not a reliable guide to their internal state without knowing their emotional register. Empathy applied through your own cultural lens to someone operating in a different one is frequently just projection with good intentions. The person who has developed genuine empathic range, who can step into different emotional realities, who validates without condescending, who makes people feel known rather than managed, doesn't produce this effect by being endlessly nice. They produce it by being genuinely curious about what it's like to be someone else, by letting that curiosity be visible, by allowing what they learn to actually land. This is what makes certain people feel safe in a way that's almost physical. Not that they agree with you, not that they'll protect you from difficult truths, but that when you say how something feels, they don't immediately try to talk you out of it. They stay in the room with you for a moment. That moment is the invisible bridge, and most people never build it because they're too busy standing on their side, calling across. Chapter 7. The oldest technology. Data doesn't move people. It never has. You can present the facts. You can cite the research. You can build the case with such logical precision that no rational person could dispute it. And you will watch the other person nod politely, walk away entirely unchanged, and never think about it again. Not because they didn't understand, because understanding and being moved are not the same thing. The brain has a separate system for each, and the logical one is not the one that produces action, memory, or genuine persuasion. The one that does is older. Older than language, older than abstract thought, older than the part of the brain that evaluates evidence. It's the system that runs on narrative, on story, on the sequence of events experienced by a specific person in a specific moment with something at stake. This is not a soft preference. It's structural. Brain imaging shows that when you read or hear a story, a real one with a person and a situation and something that matters, your brain doesn't just process it in the language centers. It activates the sensory and motor regions associated with the events being described. Someone describes the cold before dawn at the top of a mountain, and your temperature processing regions flicker. Someone describes the weight of a decision they couldn't get right, and your emotional centers engage the way they would if the weight were yours. The brain doesn't file a good story under information received. It files it under something closer to experience had. This is the transportation effect, the technical term for what happens when a story works. You leave your own cognitive position and enter someone else's. Your critical faculties soften. Your defenses lower. Not because you've been manipulated, but because the brain, when transported, is doing what it evolved to do. Learning through simulated experience rather than abstract instruction. For most of human history, this was how knowledge moved. Not through documents, through someone saying, "Let me tell you what happened." The statistics I used at the beginning of this book, every compelling fact I cited without framing it around a person, those are already fading for you. The story of Marcus, the one I mentioned briefly in passing, is more likely to still be present. Not because Marcus is real, because the brain doesn't particularly care. It processes narrative the same way regardless of whether the events actually occurred. The simulation runs either way. You already know how to do this. You've been doing it your entire life. Every time you recount your day, explain why you're frustrated, describe why something matters to you, you're using narrative structure. The sequence of events, the moment something changed, the way it landed. You do it naturally. The question isn't whether you can tell stories. It's whether you're telling them well, or whether you're burying the best parts under scaffolding that doesn't need to be there. The architecture that works is simple. Setup, tension, resolution. Every story that's held human attention across every culture and every era follows some version of this. Setup orients the listener. Who, where, what was the situation? Tension introduces the thing that matters. The problem, the unexpected development, the moment something became uncertain. Resolution delivers the meaning. What happened? What shifted? What you now understand that you didn't before. Most people tell stories that are heavy on setup and light on tension. They spend so long establishing context that by the time the actual event arrives, the listener has already done a cost-benefit analysis and quietly decided it wasn't worth the wait. The setup should be the minimum scaffolding needed to make the tension land, nothing more. The tension is where everything lives. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It needs to be real, a moment of genuine uncertainty, a surprising turn, a small but true complication. Something that makes the listener's brain ask what happens next. That question is the hook. As long as the brain is asking it, the listener is with you. The moment the question is answered before the story is ready to answer it, you've lost them. Opening lines are where most conversational stories fail before they begin. People start with context when they should start with a grab. The moment I sat down across from him, I knew the conversation was going to be about something other than what he'd said it was about. That's an opening line. It's already created a question. Last year when I was dealing with that work situation, that's not an opening line. That's a filing label. It tells the listener where to store the story before they've decided they want it. Sensory detail is what makes the transportation effect work. Abstract recounting produces understanding. Specific sensory detail produces experience. Not, "It was stressful," but the particular quality of that silence in the room before anyone spoke. Not, "I was nervous," but the fact that I had checked my phone 4 times in the elevator and it hadn't helped. The specific, concrete detail that could only come from someone who was actually there activates the listener's sensory cortices and pulls them into the scene. You don't need much. 2 or 3 precise details do more than 20 vague ones. The goal isn't a full sensory inventory. It's the one detail that makes the scene suddenly real, the one that causes something to click into place in the listener's imagination. I was backstage at an event once, waiting to speak to a room of about 200 people on a topic I had spoken about many times before. A colleague found me in the hallway running through notes I didn't need. She said nothing clever. She just told me about the first time she'd presented to a large group, a specific detail about standing behind the curtain, the particular smell of the stage, the way her hands felt. She wasn't giving me advice. She was giving me company. I walked out less alone in it than I'd been before. She told that story in 40 seconds. I've remembered it for years. Emotional honesty is what makes a story land, rather than just travel. You can recount events accurately and produce zero resonance. The events aren't the story. The experience of the events is the story. What you hoped, what you feared, what you got wrong, what it cost. When you share that layer, you're not just reporting. You're offering something true. And truth, expressed with appropriate precision, creates a particular kind of recognition in the listener. The feeling of yes, that, of being confirmed in something they'd felt but hadn't found language for. This is the paradox of vulnerability in storytelling. Sharing something genuinely uncertain or difficult, a real mistake, a moment of confusion, something you handled badly, doesn't undermine your credibility. It creates trust, not despite the imperfection, but through it. Because the person listening has made mistakes and been confused and handled things badly. Your willingness to acknowledge yours removes the performance. They stop relating to a presenter and start relating to a person. Humor functions as a specific tool within narrative, not decoration, not filler, but a way of delivering truth with lower resistance. The unexpected angle on a familiar situation. The observation that's technically absurd and precisely accurate simultaneously. When humor works inside a story, it doesn't lighten the story, it deepens it. The laugh confirms that something real was just said. Pace is where people lose stories they had in their hands. Rushing through the moment that everything turned in order to get to the conclusion is like sprinting past the view you climbed to see. The important moment in a story deserves to be slowed down. The pause before the reveal. The extra beat of description at the exact moment the tension peaks. This is where the story either transports or merely informs. The conversational story is different from the formal kind in one essential way. It has to be responsive. You're not delivering a monologue to a passive audience. You're in dialogue with a person who's reacting in real time. Their face tells you whether you're at the right pace, whether you've lost them, whether something just landed. You adjust as you go. You trim what isn't working and expand what is. The story you end up telling is rarely exactly the one you started. This is why storytelling in conversation is a skill and not a script. The structure is repeatable. The execution is always live. The oldest technology humans have for moving each other isn't data or argument or evidence. It's one person saying something true happened, and here's what it was like to be inside it. That technology hasn't aged. It isn't going to. Every conversation you've remembered for years was built around a moment when someone did this well. Chapter 8. The architecture of a good story. Your story is probably better than you're telling it, not the events. The events are what they are. But somewhere between the experience and the telling, something gets lost. The part that made it matter. The specific texture of the moment. The thing underneath the thing that gave the whole sequence its weight. What comes out instead is a smoothed-over, chronologically correct version that covers the facts and misses the point. This happens because people tell stories the way they'd file a report. They start at the beginning. They proceed in order. They include everything that seems relevant. They arrive at the ending. They look up. The listener is still there, physically, because leaving would be rude. But something behind their eyes has already moved on. The story wasn't bad. It was just assembled wrong. Structure isn't about formula. It's about understanding how the human mind receives narrative. What it needs early, what it can wait for, what it will forgive, what it will not. Work with that architecture, and a simple story becomes compelling. Work against it, and a genuinely extraordinary experience becomes tedious in the retelling. The first thing the architecture demands is an entry point that creates a question. Not context, not background, not the circumstances that led to the situation. A question. Something that makes the listener's brain lean forward even slightly because it doesn't yet know the answer and wants to. The cold opening is the technical version of this. Drop the listener into the middle of the action, the moment of tension, the unexpected situation, the image that doesn't yet make sense, before explaining how you got there. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes before I could go in. That's an opening. It creates immediate questions. Why couldn't you go in? What was inside? What happened? The listener is already in the story before they've agreed to be. Context can come after. Once the question is alive, the listener is motivated to receive the setup because it's now helping them answer something they're already asking. The setup that precedes the question is just delay. The setup that follows it is information. The opening line deserves more attention than it usually gets because it's doing two things simultaneously. It's creating the initial question, and it's establishing the register of the story, the emotional tone, the level of seriousness, the degree of self-awareness the narrator is bringing. An opening that's slightly self-deprecating sets up a different story than one that's quietly ominous. Both can work. What doesn't work is an opening that's tonally neutral and informationally empty. It tells the listener nothing and asks nothing. It's an invitation to pay attention that gives them no reason to accept. Tension is the engine, and most people understand this intellectually, while consistently underusing it. They note the complication and move past it quickly, as though the difficulty is something to acknowledge and leave behind rather than the thing worth staying in. The complication, the moment something became uncertain, the point where the outcome was genuinely unclear, the junction where things could have gone multiple ways, that's where the story lives. Not before it, and not after it, inside it. This means slowing down precisely where the instinct is to speed up. The moment of maximum uncertainty deserves the most real estate. Not necessarily more words. Sometimes a single sentence at the right pace does more than a paragraph at the wrong one. But the moment should be felt. The listener should be briefly uncertain along with you. That shared uncertainty is what makes the resolution land. Without tension that's actually inhabited, resolution is just information. With it, resolution is relief. Those are completely different experiences. The ending is where most conversational stories fail in a second distinct way. People over-explain what their story meant. They arrive at the resolution, deliver the actual ending, and then continue, summarizing the lesson, articulating the moral, making sure the listener understood what they were supposed to take away. This is almost always a mistake. It's the storyteller not trusting either their story or their listener. A story that has to explain what it meant probably didn't quite land. And a story that landed doesn't need explanation. The listener already has it. The explicit lesson delivered after the ending is like a comedian explaining why the joke was funny. It doesn't clarify. It dissolves whatever effect had just been created. The better instinct is to end at the moment of resolution and let the silence do the rest. Give the listener a beat to sit with what just happened. Their brain is already processing the meaning. Let it. Resist the urge to fill the space. The specific detail problem runs through almost every weak story. People describe things at the level of category when they should be describing at the level of instance. Not a long meeting. The meeting that had been scheduled for 45 minutes and ran until everyone missed their next thing and nobody said anything about it. Not an awkward silence. The silence after he asked the question and everyone in the room found something on the table to look at. Category tells you what something was. Instance shows you what it was actually like. The single, precise detail that couldn't have come from imagination, the specific kind, the actual texture, the real brand or color or quality. Does something vague description cannot. It confirms that you were actually there. The listener's brain treats it as evidence of the real and adjusts accordingly. The simulation becomes more vivid. The transportation deepens. One or two of these details per story, not an inventory. The selection of which detail to include is its own skill. You're looking for the one that carries the most atmosphere in the least space. The one that, if you removed it, the scene would become noticeably less real. Pacing is the control that most people leave on default. They tell the whole story at roughly the same speed. The unimportant parts and the crucial parts delivered with similar weight and similar rhythm. The result is that the listener can't tell what matters. Everything has equal weight, which means nothing has particular weight. Variable pace is how you direct attention. Early setup can move quickly. You're covering ground the listener needs, but doesn't need to linger in. As tension builds, slow down. At the moment of maximum uncertainty, stop almost entirely. Let the beat breathe. Then the resolution can arrive cleanly. And if you've paced it right, even a quiet resolution will land with weight. The pause itself is punctuation. A half-second pause before the keyword. A full beat after the thing that's supposed to land. These aren't dramatic flourishes. They're structural tools that tell the listener's brain, this part matters. Receive it carefully. The brain follows that instruction. Humor inside a story operates by a specific mechanism. It works when the observation is both unexpected and accurate. When the listener thinks that's absurd and immediately follows it with, and also completely true. The laugh confirms the accuracy. If the observation is unexpected but not accurate, it's just weird. If it's accurate but not unexpected, it's obvious. The overlap of both is where the laugh lives. The self-aware narrator who can note the absurdity of their own situation, who can describe their own confusion or mistake with a precision that makes it funny without making it performance, creates a particular kind of intimacy. The listener is being let in on something. The storyteller is saying, "I know how this looks," and finding that genuinely amusing. That's a specific kind of trust being extended, and people respond to it with warmth. I was once at a dinner where someone told a story about a professional failure, a project that had collapsed publicly, expensively, in a way that involved a significant personal embarrassment. He told it straight. No defensive framing, no preemptive minimization, no lesson bookending it. Just what happened, how it felt, the specific moment he understood it was over. He ended it there. The table was quieter than it had been all evening. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something true just entered the room. Someone asked a question, then someone else did. The whole energy shifted from the performance of dinner conversation to something that felt like people actually talking. He hadn't told a dramatic story. he told an honest one, with the right architecture around it. The story you have, the experience you keep meaning to tell but haven't found the right way into, almost certainly has more in it than you've been accessing. Not because you need to embellish it, because you haven't yet found where the tension actually is, or what the one true detail is, or where it ends before you start explaining it. Find those three things. The rest takes care of itself. Chapter 9. The Chemistry of Laughter. Humor is not about being funny. It's about being accurate enough to be surprising. The people who make rooms shift, who change the temperature of a conversation with a single observation, aren't performing. They're not working toward a punchline they prepared earlier. They're paying attention with a particular quality of precision, and then saying the thing that's true in a way that nobody else had quite said it yet. The laugh is the audience confirming the accuracy. That's all it is. This distinction matters because most people who think they lack a sense of humor are actually just confusing humor with performance. They imagine it requires a specific personality type, a fast twitch verbal reflex, some innate comedic gift that either showed up in childhood or didn't. They've watched people who are genuinely funny and concluded the gap is talent. It usually isn't. It's attention. The brain rewards what researchers call benign violations, moments where something simultaneously breaks a pattern and remains harmless. The pattern break creates surprise. The harmlessness creates safety. The combination produces laughter. This is the mechanism. It's not mystical. It's a specific cognitive event, and once you understand what triggers it, you can start to see potential violations everywhere, because everyday life is full of them. The things that are actually funny are almost always hiding in plain sight. The small gap between how something is supposed to work and how it actually works. The moment where the official version of events and the real version diverge in a way everyone recognizes, but nobody says. The observation about human behavior that's slightly uncomfortable because it's slightly too accurate. These aren't invented. They're found. The skill is in the finding, and then the precise articulation. The words that capture the gap without over-explaining it. Over-explanation is where humor goes to die. The joke that arrives with setup, punchline, and footnote. The observation delivered and then immediately unpacked. Humor operates on compression. It requires that the listener's brain close the gap themselves. The moment of closure is where the laugh lives. If you close the gap for them, there's nothing left to land. You've handed them a solved puzzle and asked them to appreciate it. This is why the most reliably funny people often say less, not more. They've found the minimum number of words required to create the gap and stopped there. Everything beyond that minimum is working against them. Timing is the variable that makes the same observation land or not land, and timing is almost entirely about reading the room in real time. There's a moment in conversation where a particular observation becomes available, where the setup has been provided by whatever's happening, and the right thing said right now would complete a circuit. That window is often brief. It requires that you're paying enough attention to notice it and quick enough to step through before it closes. This is why humor and listening are related skills. You can't find the timing if you're not actually tracking the conversation. People who are good at well-placed observations are usually also good at genuinely paying attention. The two develop together because the material for one comes from the other. Delivery shapes whether the observation reads as wit or aggression or confusion. The slight smile before you say it, not the full grin, just the corner of the mouth signaling that what's coming is playful. The pause that creates a beat of anticipation. The flat, understated tone that says, "I'm aware this is absurd," without underlining it. These are the nonverbal signals that frame the observation as benign. Without them, the same words can read as criticism or as a non sequitur. Self-deprecating humor occupies a specific and underestimated position in all of this. It signals something that straightforwardly clever humor doesn't: that you don't take yourself more seriously than the situation warrants. That you can see yourself from outside and find the view occasionally ridiculous. This combination of self-awareness and security is unusual enough that when people encounter it, they relax. The implicit message is, "I'm not performing perfect competence here, and that makes it safe for you not to either." The social function is real. Self-deprecation doesn't just entertain, it levels. It creates a version of the room where everyone is allowed to be human. This is why it lands particularly well in high-stakes or formal contexts. It releases pressure that was quietly making everyone more rigid. The limits are worth knowing. Self-deprecation that crosses into genuine self-criticism makes people uncomfortable because it asks them to respond, to reassure, to manage something. The version that works is light. It names the absurdity of a specific moment without suggesting a broader crisis. The version that doesn't work is heavy enough to require consolation. One makes people laugh, the other makes them unsure what to do. Banter is the collaborative form, and it has a different architecture than solo observation. It's a sequence, not a single move. One person introduces a slightly absurd premise. The other builds on it rather than just laughing and moving on. The first person extends the extension. The exchange escalates through a few rounds until it reaches a natural peak and someone lets it land. The whole thing is a construction project that both people are building simultaneously, and the pleasure of it is partly in the construction itself. The improv principle at the center of good banter is yes, and the commitment to extend rather than redirect. Someone says the conference room is so cold, I should have brought survival gear. The yes and response takes that premise and adds to it. We could log the hours as wilderness training. The redirect response returns the conversation to a different track entirely. Redirecting kills the momentum. The yes, and keeps the circuit alive. The test of whether teasing has remained playful is simple. Is the other person also laughing? Or are they producing the particular smile people use when they want to appear unbothered? The first is banter. The second is something that has crossed a line without the crosser noticing. Good-natured teasing targets situations and behaviors. It never targets core attributes: how someone looks, what they fundamentally are, the things they can't change. The first is a shared observation about something external. The second is an assessment of a person dressed as humor. The distinction matters because both can produce laughter in the short term. The difference is what they leave behind. One creates warmth. The other creates a small, permanent wound that the person learns not to mention. Cultural intelligence is required here in a way that's easy to underestimate. Humor is deeply culturally embedded. The specific forms it takes, the subjects that are available for observation, the relationship between irony and sincerity, the degree to which self-deprecation reads as authentic versus alarming. What travels across all of it is the observation that's true, because truth in some form is recognizable regardless of the specific cultural idiom it's expressed in. When humor doesn't land, and it won't sometimes, regardless of accuracy or timing or delivery, the graceful move is to acknowledge it without theater. Something that communicates, "I know," that one didn't quite get there. Delivered without the visible embarrassment that makes observers more uncomfortable than the misfire itself. The willingness to miss occasionally and remain unbothered is part of the same quality that makes someone good at humor in the first place. You can't be genuinely playful while also being terrified of the misfire. The two don't coexist. The neurochemistry underneath all of this is worth understanding once, so you stop thinking of humor as optional decoration. When people laugh together, actually laugh, the real version, the brain releases endorphins. Social bonds form. Trust increases. Defensive postures lower. The shared laugh is a biochemical event that changes the relationship, subtly but measurably, in the direction of closeness. This is ancient. Laughter as a social signal predates language. It communicates safety and cohesion in a frequency the nervous system recognizes before the conscious mind processes it. When you make someone genuinely laugh, you're not just entertaining them. You're triggering a biological bonding response that their brain will associate with you. They will feel better around you than they can explain. They will seek out your company without being entirely sure why. They will describe you as easy to be around, as someone they just like, without being able to point to what specifically produces that feeling. What produces it is a series of small moments where their brain was surprised by something true, and afterward, without knowing why, they want more of it. Chapter 10. Fire and Oxygen. Every relationship you've watched quietly die had a conversation that never happened. Not a blow-up, not a dramatic rupture. A quiet accumulation of things left unsaid. The frustration mentioned to someone else instead of the person involved. The boundary crossed and not named. The pattern noticed and tolerated until tolerating it became impossible. By the time the relationship ends or goes cold or reduces to polite maintenance interaction, both people are usually surprised by how far things have drifted. They shouldn't be. The drift had a specific origin. A moment, or several moments, where the difficult thing was available to be said and wasn't. People avoid hard conversations for reasons that feel, in the moment, completely rational. It's not the right time. They'll probably be defensive. It might make things worse. I don't want to seem petty. It'll blow over on its own. These aren't irrational. They're accurate predictions about short-term discomfort. What they systematically underestimate is the long-term cost of the alternative, the silent resentment that compounds, the distance that grows in the space where honesty should be, the relationship that slowly hollows out from the inside, because neither person would say the thing. The irony is visible from outside, but almost impossible to feel from inside. The conversation you're avoiding to protect the relationship is the one that would actually protect it. The discomfort you're postponing is accumulating interest. You will pay it eventually, either in a difficult conversation you chose, or in a relationship quietly ending in a way you didn't. Most people, when they finally decide to have the hard conversation, make their first mistake before they say a word. They choose the wrong moment. They bring it up when one person is rushed, or tired, or already carrying something else, or when there's an audience nearby. These aren't just suboptimal conditions. They're near guarantees of a bad outcome. A person who's rushed produces clipped responses and half attention. A person who's tired has reduced capacity for emotional regulation and nuance. A person who's aware of being observed has an additional audience to manage, which activates defensive behavior that has nothing to do with you. The setting deserves actual thought, private, unhurried. A moment when both people have the bandwidth to be fully present. This alone changes the odds significantly before anyone has said anything. The first words carry disproportionate weight. Relationship researchers call it the soft startup, the opening of a difficult conversation that signals intention and respect rather than attack. The way you begin determines whether the other person's nervous system reads this as a collaborative problem to solve together or a threat to defend against. Once the threat response activates, you're no longer talking to the person. You're talking to their defenses. And defenses, by design, aren't trying to understand you. They're trying to survive you. A soft startup doesn't require elaborate choreography. It requires three things: a genuine acknowledgement of the relationship or the other person's perspective, an honest statement of your own position without making it an accusation, and a signal that you're here to figure something out together, not to deliver a verdict. I value how we've worked together, and there's something I've been sitting with that I'd rather say directly than let build. That's not a script. It's a temperature. It says, this is coming from care, not attack. The other person's nervous system receives it before their brain processes the content. What comes immediately after the opening is where most difficult conversations detonate. The pronoun matters more than people realize. You statements, you always, you never, you make me feel, do something specific and reliable in the listener's nervous system. They make the person the subject of the sentence. They take whatever the behavior was and attach it to the identity. You always dismiss my input isn't a description of a behavior pattern. It's a character assessment. The person receiving it doesn't hear feedback. They hear accusation. The natural, almost involuntary response is to defend themselves, which means arguing with your characterization rather than engaging with the underlying concern. I statements don't soften the message. They redirect the subject from them to you. I felt dismissed in that meeting when my proposal wasn't addressed. That's not a claim about who they are. It's a report of what you experienced. It's harder to argue with. It's also more accurate because you actually know what you experienced. You don't actually know what they intended. Specificity is the other structural element that determines whether this conversation produces understanding or defensiveness. Vague complaints, "You're always inconsiderate, you never listen," are categorically easier to dispute than specific ones. Always and never are almost always false, and the person receiving them spends their energy finding exceptions rather than hearing the underlying concern. One specific moment, described accurately with your actual experience of it, is harder to dismiss and easier to engage with. When the conversation is underway, the emotional temperature is the variable you're most responsible for managing, not eliminating. Emotions contain real information, and suppressing them produces a particular kind of dishonesty. Managing. Keeping the temperature in the range where both people can still access their full cognitive capacity, because above a certain threshold, the conversation stops being a conversation and becomes a mutual escalation event that solves nothing. The physical signal of your own escalation is usually available before the verbal one. Heart rate increases. The chest tightens. Something in the jaw or the shoulders. When those signals appear, the most effective move is the one that feels least natural. Not continuing, not pushing through, but pausing. A few deliberate breaths. The explicit acknowledgement, to yourself or aloud, that you're feeling strongly about this and need a moment to collect your thoughts before continuing. This isn't weakness. It's the strategic preservation of your own cognitive function. An escalated person gives a worse version of the argument they actually have. When the other person escalates, the response that works least is matching their intensity. The response that works most is the one that steps out of the escalation loop rather than joining it. Acknowledging their emotion, not agreeing with their interpretation, but recognizing that they're feeling something strongly and that the feeling makes sense. removes the additional pressure of feeling unheard on top of whatever they're already dealing with. I can see this is really affecting you. I want to understand your perspective better. That's not capitulation, it's de-escalation. The conversation becomes possible again. The reframe that changes everything is the one that stops treating the conversation as you versus them and starts treating it as both of you versus the problem. This sounds simple. It requires a genuine internal shift that most people resist because it asks them to temporarily give up the position of being right. The collaborative frame doesn't mean abandoning your concerns. It means investigating whether there's a solution that addresses both sets of concerns, which usually requires understanding what their concerns actually are, rather than just waiting to counter them. The question that opens this frame is the one about interests rather than positions. What are you actually trying to protect here? What matters most to you in how this gets resolved? Not what do you want? That question invites positions. But what's underneath what you want? That question invites the real conversation. When the conversation ends, it should end with something concrete. Not necessarily resolution. Some things don't resolve in one sitting. But clarity about where things stand, what's been understood, what happens next. The difficult conversation that trails off ambiguously leaves both people carrying the weight of uncertainty on top of everything else. Even if perfect agreement wasn't reached, naming what was understood closes the loop enough that people can move rather than circle. The ending also deserves a moment of acknowledgement. Not mandatory ceremony. Just a brief recognition that what just happened was real, that both people engaged with something uncomfortable, and that has value regardless of whether everything was solved. Thank you for being willing to talk about this directly. That's not hollow politeness. It's the naming of something true. The willingness to have hard conversations is itself a form of respect. The most durable relationships aren't the ones where nothing difficult ever arises. They're the ones where difficult things get said anyway, and the relationship survives them and is stronger for it. The proof that something can withstand honesty is the most reliable foundation trust can have. Every relationship that matters to you has had a conversation it hasn't had yet. Some of them are waiting. Chapter 11. The language of non-accusation. The word "you" in an argument is almost always a grenade, not always thrown with intent. Usually it arrives wrapped in genuine frustration, in the honest expression of a real grievance, in the completely understandable need to communicate that something happened, and it mattered. The intention is to be heard. The effect is to trigger a defensive response so fast and so thorough that being heard becomes impossible. The other person isn't listening anymore. They're building a counter-argument. They're finding exceptions. They're protecting something. You created this, without meaning to, with one word. Language in conflict is not neutral delivery infrastructure. It's an active participant in the conversation. The words you choose determine whether the other person's nervous system reads what's coming as information or as attack. Once it reads attack, the rational, empathetic, collaborative version of them steps back and the defensive version steps forward. And the defensive version is not trying to understand you. It's trying to not be the villain in your story. The difference between "I felt dismissed when my idea wasn't addressed" and "you dismissed my idea" sounds like a minor syntactical variation. It isn't. The first is a report about your internal experience, something you genuinely know, something that's hard to dispute, something that keeps you as the subject. The second is a claim about their behavior and implicitly their character. The first invites a response. The second invites a defense. This isn't about protecting people from uncomfortable truths. It's about whether the truth actually lands. A message that triggers full defensive response has not been received. It has been processed as threat and returned. You can be entirely right about the substance and still fail to communicate it, because the delivery activated the mechanism that makes receiving it impossible. The structure of a statement that gets heard has 4 components, and they matter in sequence. The specific situation, not a pattern, not a generalization, the actual instance. Your experience of it, what you felt, what you noticed, not what you concluded about their motives. The impact, what it meant for you, why it mattered, and what you need going forward, stated as a preference or a request, not a demand or a verdict. When the project deadline changed on Wednesday without the team being consulted, I felt anxious about our ability to deliver quality work, and I need us to have a process where those decisions get discussed first. Every component is doing something. The specific situation gives them something concrete to respond to rather than a global accusation to refute. Your experience keeps you as the narrator of your own feelings rather than the judge of their character. The impact explains why this matters without assigning blame for it. The need points forward rather than dwelling in the grievance. Compare that to the version most people actually produce. You always make decisions without thinking about how it affects the rest of us. That sentence contains a character assessment, disguised as an observation. The word always is a universal claim that invites the other person to immediately begin cataloging exceptions. The phrase "without thinking" implies a conclusion about their internal process that you cannot actually know. The phrase affects the rest of us escalates from a specific concern to a collective one in a way that's harder to address. Every element of it is working against the thing you're trying to accomplish. Absolute language is worth its own treatment because people use it constantly without noticing how much work it does against them. Always. Never. Every time. You always do this. You never listen. Every single time we talk about this. These words feel accurate when you're frustrated because the pattern is real. The behavior has happened multiple times, and the cumulative weight of it is what's making this feel urgent. But the absolute language turns a valid observation about a pattern into a claim that can be disproved with a single exception. And the person you're talking to will find the exception. They will use it to argue that the pattern isn't real. You'll spend the next 10 minutes debating frequency rather than addressing the actual concern. Replace always with the last few times, or recently, or in our last 3 conversations. The pattern is still named. The absolutism is gone. The other person has less purchase to argue with and more space to actually hear what you're saying. Specificity does more than reduce defensiveness. It makes the feedback actionable. Your difficult to work with is information a person genuinely cannot do anything with. It's a verdict. When the proposal was returned with major changes the day before the presentation, without any prior discussion, I was caught off guard, and it affected my ability to prepare. That's something a person can do something with. They know exactly what happened, when it happened, and what effect it had. If they're willing to engage rather than defend, there's something concrete to work with. The delivery underneath the words matters as much as the words themselves. The same I statement delivered with controlled contempt. The flat voice. The slightly too precise diction. The eyes that say I am being very patient with you. Lands differently than one delivered with genuine curiosity about the other person's experience. The words are non-accusatory. The tone is the accusation. People hear tone before content. The nonverbal channel is older and more trusted. This is why the internal state you're in when you have the conversation shapes the outcome almost as much as the language you use. Walking in having already decided the other person is wrong or careless or acting in bad faith produces a particular quality of attention, one that's listening for confirmation rather than understanding. The other person senses the verdict before you've delivered it. They respond to the verdict rather than the words. The internal position that produces the most useful conversations is genuine curiosity about their perspective. Not performed curiosity, not the nodding that's actually waiting. Real wondering about what their experience of the situation was, what they were trying to accomplish, what they might have been navigating that you don't have full visibility into. This doesn't require assuming they were right. It requires acknowledging that you have incomplete information about their experience of events you were both present for. Acknowledging your own contribution is the move that consistently disarms defensive response, and almost nobody makes it because it feels like concession. It isn't. It's accuracy. In most interpersonal conflicts, both people did something. The narrative in your head probably features your grievance with clarity and their contribution with precision, while your own role exists in softer focus. Naming your own part explicitly, "I also could have flagged this earlier rather than letting it build," is not weakening your position. It's demonstrating that you're here for understanding rather than prosecution. That shift in perceived intent changes what the other person feels safe offering you. Validation doesn't mean agreement. This distinction is one of the most useful things a person can internalize about difficult conversations. You can say, "I understand why you felt that way," given your read on the situation, while simultaneously holding a completely different view of the situation. You're not confirming their interpretation. You're confirming that their interpretation makes sense from where they're standing. These are different claims. The first closes down the conversation. The second opens it. Because a person who feels their perspective has been acknowledged doesn't need to keep arguing for it to be acknowledged. The question that cuts through more conflict than almost any other is simple. What was your experience of this? Not what were you thinking? Not what were you trying to do, but what was your experience? It invites the full version of their perspective rather than the defended version. It signals that you're genuinely interested in understanding rather than winning. And it consistently produces information that changes the conversation. Context you didn't have, pressures you weren't aware of, a version of events that makes their behavior suddenly comprehensible, even if it remains problematic. There's a moment in difficult conversations that people consistently mishandle. The moment when the other person says something that's partially true but framed in a way that's unfair. The instinct is to reject the whole thing because the framing is wrong. But rejecting the whole thing because the framing is wrong means throwing away the part that's accurate. And the part that's accurate is usually the part you most need to hear. The better move is to separate the content from the framing, to acknowledge what's true in what they said without validating the way it was said. You're right that I've been less communicative about timelines. That's accurate, and I want to address it. The way you said that felt like an attack, and I'd rather we talked about this without that tone. Both things can be true. The acknowledgement of what's valid prevents the whole conversation from becoming a battle over framing. The naming of the tone problem addresses it without turning it into the main event. Language in difficult conversations is not just the medium, it's part of the message. The choice to describe your experience rather than their character, to be specific rather than global, to express your need rather than deliver your verdict. These aren't just tactical choices. They're signals about what kind of conversation you're trying to have. People respond to those signals before they respond to anything you've said. The conversation you're trying to have is the one where both people can actually hear each other. That conversation is available. Most people just keep sending the wrong invitation. Chapter 12. The collaborative frame. Most arguments aren't actually about what they're about. The argument about the dishes isn't about the dishes. The argument about the deadline is rarely entirely about the deadline. The argument about who said what in which meeting is almost never really about the meeting. Underneath the stated conflict is a different conversation about respect, or autonomy, or fairness, or the feeling of being consistently overlooked. The stated issue is the surface. The actual issue is what's been accumulating beneath it. Most people argue about the surface. They win or lose on the surface. And then the actual issue, untouched, continues accumulating. This is why some conflicts feel like they keep recurring in slightly different forms. The specific topic changes, but the emotional signature is identical. The same heat, the same withdrawal, the same feeling afterward of something unresolved, despite the argument being technically over. The surface was addressed. The thing underneath wasn't. It will be back. The collaborative frame is the orientation that makes it possible to address the thing underneath. It isn't a technique. It's a genuine shift in how you conceptualize what's happening. The default orientation in conflict is adversarial. Two people on opposite sides of an issue, each trying to establish that their position is correct and the other's is wrong. This orientation feels natural because it mirrors how disagreement usually feels. It's also almost completely counterproductive because it turns the other person from a potential ally into an opponent whose defeat is the goal. The collaborative frame places both people on the same side. Not of the issue. You might genuinely disagree about the issue, but of the problem. We have a situation between us that's creating friction, and we both presumably want that friction resolved. That's the shared ground. The problem exists outside both of you. You're both looking at it. The question isn't who's right about it, but what you're going to do about it together. This reframe can be made explicit without it feeling like a maneuver. I don't want to spend this conversation arguing about whose version is correct. I want to figure out what we're actually dealing with and what we can do about it. That's not a script. It's an honest statement of a different goal. When both people hear that the goal has changed from winning to solving, the defensive energy that was being generated for the argument doesn't have anywhere useful to go. It dissipates. The conversation becomes possible. The distinction between positions and interests is the analytical tool that makes the collaborative frame functional. A position is what someone says they want. An interest is why they want it. The underlying need, value, or concern that the position is designed to address. People argue about positions. They solve through interests. Two people arguing about whether a project should be delayed or delivered on time are arguing about positions. One person's position is, delay it. The other's is, deliver it now. Those positions are directly opposed. There's no obvious compromise. But underneath the position to delay is probably an interest in quality, or in not overextending the team, or in protecting a reputation. Underneath the position to deliver is probably an interest in client relationship, or in revenue timing, or in demonstrating reliability. Those interests are not necessarily opposed. There may be multiple ways to address both, but nobody finds those ways while they're arguing about the surface positions. Because the surface positions look like a zero-sum game. The question that opens the interests layer is deceptively simple. What matters most to you here? Not what do you want? That question invites a position. What matters most? That question invites the concern underneath it. The answer to that question is what you're actually negotiating with. The position was just a guess about how to get it. Understanding their interests doesn't require agreeing with their position. It requires genuine curiosity about what they're trying to protect. This curiosity is worth developing for purely practical reasons. The person who understands what the other person is actually trying to protect is operating with more information than the person who's only responding to what they said they want. More information produces better solutions. Better solutions are ones both people can actually live with. The brainstorming phase is where collaborative problem-solving becomes generative rather than defensive, and it has one critical structural requirement. Options must be generated before any of them are evaluated. This is the rule most people break immediately, because the instinct when an option is suggested is to assess it, to note why it might not work, to identify the problems with it, to counter it with a better option. Every time this happens, the person who suggested the option receives the message that their contribution was inadequate. They become less likely to offer the next one. The space contracts. What I'm going to suggest is probably going to sound initially impractical. Stays in the brainstorming. Let's think of everything that might address both our concerns before we evaluate any of it. This creates a temporary moratorium on evaluation that allows the field of options to expand before anyone narrows it. The constraint is brief, and the payoff is real. Groups that separate generation from evaluation consistently produce better solutions than those that evaluate as they go. Acknowledging your own contribution is the move that most reliably shifts the dynamic in a stuck conversation, and most people resist it for the same reason they resist it in the language of non-accusation. It feels like conceding ground. In an adversarial frame, it is conceding ground. In a collaborative frame, it's information about the problem. The problem between you and the other person almost certainly involves contributions from both directions. Naming yours first doesn't validate theirs. It demonstrates that you're more interested in accuracy than in winning. I've been less clear about my expectations than I could have been, and I think that's contributed to some of this. That sentence changes the structure of the conversation in a way that's disproportionate to what it concedes. It signals that you're not here to prosecute. It reduces the other person's need to stay defended. It models the kind of honesty that tends to be reciprocal. People who are shown genuine accountability often produce it in response without being asked. The joint construction of solutions is different in quality from the acceptance of solutions. When a solution is proposed by one party and accepted by the other, the accepting party has implicitly confirmed the proposing party's superior understanding of the situation. There's a subtle power differential embedded in the transaction. When both parties construct the solution together, when each person's contribution to the design is visible in the final version, both people own it. Ownership produces a different quality of follow-through. The solution was ours, not theirs. The commitment to it is correspondingly different. This requires slowing down the part of the process most people want to accelerate, the part where the solution gets decided. Moving quickly to decision feels efficient. It often means one person's solution gets adopted and the other person's concerns get compressed out of the final design. The solution works on paper and fails in practice because the person who didn't design it never fully believed in it. What do you think would actually help here? What would a resolution look like from your end? These questions invite construction rather than acceptance. They treat the other person as an architect of the solution rather than a recipient of it. The answers are frequently surprising. What someone says they need when asked directly is often simpler and more achievable than what you assumed they needed. Not every conflict resolves. Some issues have no clean solution. Some differences are real and durable. The collaborative frame doesn't promise resolution. It promises that if resolution is available, this is the orientation most likely to find it. And where resolution isn't available, it promises something almost as valuable: clarity. The shared understanding of where things actually stand, what's possible and what isn't, is its own form of closure. Ambiguity is the thing that keeps wounds open. Clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, allows things to move. The resolution cycle completes with something concrete, regardless of whether perfect agreement was reached. What have we understood about each other that we didn't before? What's our shared plan from here, even if it's partial? What do we each need in order to move forward? These questions pull the conversation toward action rather than leaving it circling in understanding. Understanding without any corresponding movement is satisfying in the moment and frustrating in retrospect. Expressing genuine appreciation for the conversation itself, not the outcome, the conversation, is the closing move that most people skip because it sounds ceremonial. It isn't. It names something real. The person was willing to engage with something uncomfortable, and that willingness is not nothing. It's a choice they made. Acknowledging it says the relationship mattered enough to have this conversation, and that matters enough to be said. Thank you for working through this with me. 3 seconds, and it changes what the conversation meant. The relationships that last are not the ones with the fewest conflicts. They're the ones where conflicts become, over time, evidence of trust rather than evidence of incompatibility. Where the hard conversation that happened 3 years ago is now a reference point. Remember when we figured that out? The capacity to work through something together is the proof that the relationship can hold weight. Most people treat conflict as a thing that happens to relationships. The collaborative frame understands it as something that, handled well, happens for them. The conversation isn't the threat. Avoiding it is. Conclusion. You don't become magnetic by working harder at it. That's the thing nobody says at the beginning, because it would make the whole project sound impossible. But it's true, and you probably felt it somewhere in these pages before it was stated directly. The effort that goes into performing connection is the same effort that prevents it. The work isn't toward magnetism. The work is toward the version of yourself that doesn't need to perform it. That version exists. You've met them occasionally. In conversations that surprised you by going somewhere real, in moments when you forgot to monitor yourself and something genuine came out instead. Those moments weren't accidents. They were previews. They were what becomes available when the interference clears. What you've built here is the capacity to clear it more consistently. The presence that stops the self-monitoring loop. The listening that makes people feel received rather than processed. The empathy that steps inside rather than observing from outside. The stories that carry actual truth rather than polished recounting. The humor that confirms something real. The difficult conversations that protect what avoidance would quietly destroy. And underneath all of it, the thread, the authentic self that gives every skill its meaning and every technique its warmth. None of it will be smooth immediately. The skills will feel conscious before they feel natural. You'll notice yourself using them, and that noticing will make them slightly awkward. The way watching your own feet while walking produces a temporary uncertainty about something that was previously automatic. This is not failure. This is how integration works. The awkward conscious phase is the necessary passage between not having the skill and having it fully. What you're building isn't a better performance. It's a shorter distance between who you are and how you come across. When that distance closes, and it does close, with practice, with time, with the willingness to keep showing up imperfectly, something shifts. People start seeking you out without knowing why. Conversations find their real level faster. The connections that used to feel like they were happening to everyone except you start happening to you, because you've become someone capable of meeting them. That person was always available. You were just in the way.